So, welcome everybody. Hi everyone to a new episode of Dare to Care, your animal welfare podcast. Thank you for listening in. I am Annette, your host for today. And for today's episode, I'm very excited to learn more about the well-being of exotics. I think in particular reptiles, or more precisely snakes, like a good management and handling and husbandry based on their behavior. And yeah, for this topic, I'm very happy to have our specialist, Lori Torrini, on board with me today. She is animal trainer, certified, and behaviorist based in the US. Welcome, Lori. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be speaking with you.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts, experience, knowledge, and yeah, I'm very excited to learn more and dive into the topic. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit more for our listeners so we know more about you and what you do?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, I would be happy to. So I'm Lori
Thank
Torrini.
you.
I live in the United States. I live in Colorado. I did live in Germany for 2 years in my younger days, and I rode horses over there, and I think it's been many years since I went back. 2011 was the last time I was there riding with my trainer. So, but I love the country, and I was excited to work with you on this podcast and on potentially some other projects. And I'm always happy and pleased to talk about animal behavior, animal training, and welfare, especially when it comes to the species that you don't think of in terms of those topics. So as far as my background, I've worked with animals most of my life, with horses and dogs, and then later exotic animals. My formal education is in animal health and behavior and animal science and behavior. My undergrad is in animal health and behavior. I have an associate in zoo science, and then my master's is in animal science and behavior. But right now I'm in a doctoral program that's a general psychology program, and I'm focusing on human-animal interactions. So I wear a lot of different hats. I have my own behavior and training business, Behavior Education, and I work with private individuals as well as private organizations, so zoos or sanctuaries or breeders. And then I work with individuals who are usually pet owners who may just have one animal or a few animals. And I do whatever their behavior and training needs are. I do private coaching for them. I used to teach group classes, both with horses and dogs, but I don't do that anymore. Now I teach private one-on-one coaching with people and their animals, or organizations and their animals. And then I am also the director of Spirit Keeper Animal Sanctuary, which is a 501c3 nonprofit here in Colorado that takes in special needs animals and puts them into a sanctuary for life program. And so they're animals that have special needs that preclude them from being sold, rehomed, or adopted out in a traditional manner. And usually those are chronic behavioral issues, medical, some type of health issue where a sanctuary setting is appropriate for them, and they will stay here for life. And so Spirit Keeper Animal Sanctuary staff is all volunteer, including my job. We don't have any paid employees. So the board of directors, all of the staff are all volunteers.
And how come? I also think it's significant also, to focus on maybe not the common species and animal groups only that you easily think of. And how come that you focused more on exotics and these types of animals?
Yeah, so I started to focus more on exotics. It was when I was studying zookeeping back in 2017. I had a pet snake when I was much younger, in my early 20s, and I really enjoyed that animal and had it for a very long time. But it wasn't until I was studying zoo science that I really decided that I loved the herpetology courses that I took. And I became enamored with the carpet pythons that were assigned to me to take care of during that program.
Mm.
And I ended up getting some carpet pythons personally after I graduated from that. So it was really since 2017, 2018 that I started delving into reptiles professionally. And from there, a few other exotic species, just because I had been studying zoo science. And I really, really liked the idea of being able to work with these animals that weren't traditional pets or even traditional livestock and do behavior modification and training with them, specifically cooperative care training. So, non-coercive, non-force-based training, which is common in most accredited zoos, where you're
Mm-hmm.
teaching animals to voluntarily participate in their
Mm.
own care. And I started working with snakes here at my facility on cooperative care, teaching them specifically to target train in order to shift out of their primary habitat and into temporary holding. And then when that worked so well, I started teaching them other things, like to follow a target into a transport carrier, to follow a target onto a scale. I just started challenging myself and the snakes to see what they were able to learn. Some discrimination training,
Mm.
like if I taught them to follow a specific target, but showed them a different target, would they go to the one that they, had learned to follow, or would they get confused because there were two there? And I was actually able to teach a couple of snakes that were cohabitated, each their own target, and they would each go to their own target. So I could
Mm.
show them both targets and they would each go to their assigned target. And those things were really exciting for me as a trainer and behaviorist, to see some non-traditional
Mm-hmm.
species doing some of these training and behavior tasks that are pretty common in dogs and cats and things like potbelly pigs. Pigs are very intelligent, and it was exciting to see that snakes were able to do these activities as well.
And that brings me also to my next and more detailed questions, like how these practices, the training that you can apply, how it can contribute to the animal's welfare, or more about the purpose behind, like, are there problems that you can solve, or is it more like a preventive measure to prevent certain issues? Can you tell us more about
Yeah,
that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I would say first and foremost, it improves the animal's well-being, because anytime
Mm-hmm.
animals are restrained, forced into things against their will, it's going to elevate their stress level
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to be unpleasant for them. And they are going to build negative affective associations with whatever's causing those negative emotions. If it's the handler, the person, the environment. So if they're being forced, to do anything, to sit on a scale, to come in and out of their habitat, to go in a carrier, and they're fearful and they're not doing it voluntarily, it makes for poor welfare for that animal. It elevates their stress level, which also equates to poor welfare. And so anytime that you can give animals the opportunity, and this includes snakes and other reptiles, to voluntarily participate in their own care, meaning that you're giving them the option to shift out of their habitat or not, and they're choosing to do that on their own, it's going to be much different of an
Mm-hmm.
experience for them than if I am forcing them out of the habitat by grabbing them or using a tool to grab them out. If I'm simply opening the door and giving them a signal that is asking them to come out and they're choosing to come out, it's going to be a positive experience for them. It's also going to make a safer experience for the keepers, the handlers, because anytime the stress level is elevated for an animal and they're experiencing fear, anxiety, distress, then they are more apt to get defensive.
Mm-hmm.
To it can go one of two ways. They can just totally shut down and be so fearful and anxious that they just shut down and withdraw, or they can become more aggressive and defensive because they're so frightened. And to avoid all that, if you can simply ask them, hey, will you shift into this carrier? Will you come out of your habitat? Will you move from this location to this other location for me? And they do it of their own free will, then there is no elevated stress level. Everybody's happy, and it's safer for me to do the enclosure maintenance or whatever it is I need to do. And then they have a more positive experience in association with their keepers, and they can build more trust with us. Instead of being fearful of us, now they trust us, and they can even come to view us as something positive, especially if they're getting reinforced for their behavior with something they like. Usually it's food, but there are other things that we can use as reinforcers.
Yeah, makes total sense to me. And I can imagine different scenarios, right? As you just said, maybe cleaning of the cage where the animal might need to move or veterinary visit. Yeah, I can imagine it's all better than just lifting maybe the protective environment or cave, whatever they are in, and grabbing it, and then better letting it voluntarily choose, right? As you say, coming out and maybe learning through experience what would happen next, so they are
Right.
prepared, I think, for the
Yes, that's a
situation, right?
really, really good point.
Yeah.
Predictability is huge in
Uh-huh.
keeping stress levels low. So
Yeah.
animals like predictability and routine. And so if we can teach them a cue to let
Mm.
them know what's about to happen, oftentimes the experience goes smoother, even if what's about to happen isn't something they would necessarily like an injection. As long as they know what to expect, they're a
Mm-hmm.
lot more willing to cooperate with that and to consent to those behaviors. And then they're not taken by surprise.
Mm.
And surprisingness can cause elevated stress levels, can cause reactivity like biting or other defensive behavior. And that can be more dangerous for the keepers. So if you make situations predictable and the animal knows what's about to happen, it's going to keep stress levels low.
Yeah, and I could imagine if a situation would run out of control, then they could also learn a negative outcome, right? So making it maybe even more difficult in the next
Right.
occasion or situation.
Yeah,
Ah,
that's an excellent point because if I, as a
yeah.
keeper, have do something to a snake or another animal where I'm invading their space, I'm physically forcing them out of their safe space, whether that's a hide or a tree or where a
Mm.
cave or under the soil, and they are having a very negative experience with that. They're fearful, their anxiety levels heightened, they feel distressed because they're being touched against their will, they're being forced out against their will. Maybe I'm having to restrain them so much it's painful for them, but the whole situation is distressing and scary for them. But I get the injection done, or I get them in the carrier and we get them to the vet, or I clean the cage. But the next time they have to interact with somebody, maybe that's you next time, I've ruined their experience with people, and it's going to make it harder for you if you're the next person that has to manage that animal, because now that animal has built these really negative associations with people and with that whole experience. So we're not doing the next person any favors if we
Hmm.
don't ensure that we are giving animals positive emotional experiences with humans.
Like a well-prepared, hopefully happy or
Yes.
animal that's feeling safe. As you said, predictability. And you also already mentioned the term, I think, positive reinforcement. So maybe because I was wondering about maybe a bit of the learning model
Yes.
that's behind. So it's about experiencing something positive.
So the core of the behavior modification that we do here is positive reinforcement, but
Hmm.
that's all. And we do classical and operant conditioning, and try to use positive reinforcement. And that works very well in a traditional sense with animals who have had a relatively stable development and are relatively well habituated to people and aren't innately fearful of their environment or the people in it. In other words, when you start out with an animal that already is confident and feels safe, it's easy to teach them using operant conditioning where you give them a cue or you set up an antecedent for them, they perform a behavior, and then they receive a positive consequence for that behavior. They learn very quickly to repeat that behavior. But if you're starting with an animal with past emotional trauma, who's had prior bad experiences, or who for some other reason is experiencing high levels of fear, anxiety, distress, they aren't in a position where they're in a good state of mind to learn that way. And so the very first thing that you need to do is make sure the animals feel safe, because then they can't effectively learn. If they're so scared and distressed or anxious, that all they're learning in their mind is to not be killed in that moment, then it's really hard to teach them other behaviors, like to load up in a carrier or shift out of their habitat, or even in the case of a dog, to just teach them to sit. If they're so fearful of the people and other things in their environment that they're just worried about staying alive, you're not going to be able to teach them to sit. So we first want to make sure that we are taking care of their emotional needs, that we're trying to instill good coping skills for them and resiliency, and that they're habituated to the environment that we're asking them to function in before we start formal training.
And thinking about the practical training, maybe thinking about a standard situation, maybe not a very anxious, or let's call it complicated or traumatized animal, how often would you need to train? I think maybe that's something that should be regularly applied.
Yeah, so if it's an animal that hasn't had any past bad experiences, that's coming, and I like to think of them as a clean slate. They've had a normal upbringing, a normal development, whatever that is for the species. Let's say for a snake, they've hatched out of the egg and they stayed the appropriate amount of time with mom or clutch mates and left the egg when they chose and left the nest when they chose and started to explore their environment when they chose and started to learn how to acquire resources such as food, water, shelter, to thermoregulate. And all of that went really well. And during that time, they learned some resiliency, meaning they had to overcome some stressful situations, but that they successfully navigated the world in which they were developing in. And now they're an adult animal and they know how to be a snake successfully. When I'm starting with that animal, it's actually very simple to train them because I can show them a target or teach them some other cue, pair that with something they find reinforcing like food, and they learn very quickly to associate that cue with the reinforcer. And then from there, I can shape other behaviors. It's really easy to do that with a snake, with a dog, with a horse. I'm working with a new horse right now that had a very good development. She wasn't weaned too early from her mom. And in fact, she's been with her mom the whole time. She's very confident, very independent, very well adjusted because she's had a good normal developmental period. And so she came to me ready to just learn new things, and she's learning very quickly. But if you have an animal that isn't in that position, that's where it can be a challenge because you can't just jump right into teaching them behaviors. You've got to teach them coping skills and to build resiliency and to build trust and to feel safe in their environment before they can learn normal behaviors.
Bringing them to a state or mindset or whatever kind of situation that they're prepared to continue with the next
steps.
With
a normal animal that's stable and has had a normal development, like the target training is fairly simple. I just pair the target one of two ways. I either pair the training target with food a few times until they associate that target with the food, and then I remove the food and show them the target. They usually respond to it, and then I give the food, and then I ask for more and more each time. Like, instead of looking at it, now you have to come closer to it, and instead of just coming closer to it, now you have to follow it, and I just build on that. Or I show them the target and wait for them to interact with it on their own and then reinforce that, and that's called capturing. So both of those things work, and it kind of depends on the snake species. Some snakes are going to be innately curious about novel objects, and so you show them anything and they're going to go investigate it. And you can capture that by then, if you want them to investigate it again, just reinforce them for that. Other snakes are more sensitive, maybe innately a little bit more leery of new things. And so that's where it can be helpful to pair the target with a reinforcer for a few times to get them more comfortable with it before you're showing them just the target. But either one of those routes is going to work fairly well and fairly quickly with an animal who's starting out well adjusted.
That's another interesting point. I also wanted to talk about like the differences for different species. I mean, animal groups in general, because reptiles, I mean,
Mhm.
there are so many, but even maybe when it comes down to snake species, because as you said, some might be more curious by nature, or I guess the whole concept is, of course, based, as you say, on natural behavior and
Yes.
biology of the animals.
So the
Mhm.
first thing that I do when I work with a new client or an animal that comes here, like I'm working now with some people with a group in India that's working with venomous snakes.
Uh-huh.
And they're interested in teaching the snakes to cooperatively give venom. And
Mm.
so it's a really interesting project. But the first thing with something like that is you've got to look at that snake species' natural history and natural behaviors. And so, what's their natural diet? What's the time of day when they're naturally active and awake? What does their hunting look like? Because we want to establish a training environment and a shaping plan that's going to mirror their natural hunting behavior to make it easier for them to learn the behavior we want. So, like with the pythons here, I work with a lot of Australian pythons, and they're sit and wait predators. But once they've successfully acquired prey in a location, they will return to that location even after one time. Even if
Mhm.
it's been 2 or 3 weeks, though, they will remember and associate that location with successfully having acquired prey. They'll go back to it, they'll get in an ambush position, and they will target that location. So, target training these pythons is very easy because once they associate the target with food, they're going to go to that target every single time because they know they successfully got food when they interacted with it. In fact, tonight I just had a snake on my desk because I had trained a snake earlier and had the target sitting on my desk. And
Mm.
one of my free roaming pythons from 2 rooms away came in here and I found him sitting on the training target.
The target.
So they learn this very, very well. And I
Yeah.
think it probably still smelled like I don't scent the target, but of course, if I'm pairing it with food, it's going to get some smell on it or whatever. So I don't know how he knew it was in here if he smelled it. But then once
Mm.
he saw it, then he was sitting right above it,
Mhm.
waiting. So they learn it very quickly. But if it's a species that's fossorial, like let's say a Kenyan samboa or some other burrowing snake species that spends most of their time under the soil or under the sand, first you have to get them out and aware that you're
Mhm.
doing a training session. Like I, for a short time, had a sunbeam snake here. And they are burrowers. They stay under the soil. But it only took a few times of feeding that sunbeam snake to get it to come out when it sensed that I was outside of the enclosure. And I did that first by setting a target in the enclosure with food on it, and it would smell that and come out
Mm.
after I had left and take it. I did that a few times, but then it started to associate me, my presence, and the vibration of opening the enclosure and starting to set the target down with the food, and it was coming out ahead of time now. Like when that process started, it recognized those antecedents and it would come out
Mm.
while I was still there, and I was able to then shape the targeting behavior from there. So I've had other species that tend to hide a lot, and if they can't visually see the target, you can use a scent, or I'll
Mhm.
use a light sometimes and like shine a light in the front of their hide. And then when they come out, I'll show the target, pair it with food, and eventually you can fade out either the light or the target. Like the target could become the light itself. Like you flash the light, the snake comes out, you reinforce. So
Mhm.
you have to adapt to the not only the species but the individual learner. I mean, the
Mhm.
process, the principles behind the process are the same. You teach the snake to associate the cue with the reinforcer and to learn that they need to interact and behave in some way as a response to the cue, and then they get the reinforcer. But your cue could be a visual target, it could be a scent, a smell, it could be a light, it could be a vibration.
Mhm.
So it's just a matter of starting out to teach the snake to associate A with B, and then to learn that when you perceive A, if you do this certain behavior, then you'll get the reinforcer. It's been relatively easy, to my surprise. Now that I've been doing it, like 8 years, it's a lot easier than I would have thought initially to teach the snakes to do these things. And lizards are even, I want to say that lizards are even faster because you can train them more often.
Because they eat more often,
They
or
eat more
yeah.
often. So
Wow.
with the snakes, they learn even though they eat far apart. Like I don't
Mm-hmm.
feed them more often just to train them. I just train them when they would normally eat. But
Wow.
they still remember, even if it's a month since they ate,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
they would have to remember in the wild where they found food, even if there's been a long time in
Mm-hmm.
between. So it isn't a problem, but it's just that with lizards who might eat every few days or more, like we have a leopard gecko here who eats every couple days. So that animal just gets more training repetitions in
Mm-hmm.
than the snakes do. And so it just progresses through the steps more quickly.
That also makes total sense. And I was wondering, while describing the tools and the targets, does color of a target also play a role, or is that not, for example, considering snakes, significant for their visual repertoire?
It
I'm not,
it is
yeah,
significant. It can
yeah,
be. So
it is.
if you are using a visual target, you need to know what colors your animal species can
Yeah.
likely perceive. So
Mm,
I've done a lot of research into snake vision, including color vision, and what colors they should be able to perceive based on the wavelengths of light that their eyes are designed to receive and transmit to their brains. And so, because of a lot of different factors in the way their eyes work, greens, blues, and some yellows work really well if you're going for a color signal for snakes. But they can learn context cues. So even if you have a target that's red, which is a color the snakes cannot see, there are other reptiles who can see red, and it's a very salient color for them. So this is where it's important that you know what color your animal can see. But let's say I showed a snake a red target and they can't see red, so it's just going to look like a shade of gray to them. They can still learn the context. They can still see the shape if it contrasts enough with the background, because they can perceive contrast. They're
mhm.
going to start to associate that shape that's contrasting with the background with the behavior you want them to do. So they can learn using other targets that aren't colors they're actually perceiving as a color, but I like to use colors along with contrast. So for example, the snake behind me is in a pretty simple enclosure. It's a Morelia Bredli, and so they're not really picky about substrate and foliage. In fact, in behavior trials I've done where I've given them access to completely naturalistic settings like real trees and dirt and branches, I often find them on the kitchen counter or on a smooth surface or on my desk, and they're not really using the naturalistic stuff I give them. They're just using regular stuff around the house. And so for that snake, it's not as important to him what his background is like. He just wants to be able to stretch out on stuff and climb on stuff and anchor on stuff. And so his background is pretty plain. It's black. This cage up here is empty, but it's a black background. So like royal blue, yellow, lime, or fluorescent green is going to show up. Not only will the snake be able to perceive those colors visually, but it's going to really contrast with that black background. And I have other snakes, though, that have like really decorative enclosures and a lot of green, a lot of foliage, like live plants. So to use a green target in an enclosure that has a jungle green background, it's not, that target's not going to be as salient to that snake because it's not going to contrast with that background as much. So in that case, I might want to pick a bright blue one or a bright yellow one. And so you want to look at not only what color can your snake perceive or your other animal perceive, but how much is it going to contrast with your training environment. You really want your cue to stand out apart from everything else in the environment. So if it's a visual cue, you want to make sure it's going to contrast with the background and be something that the animal can easily perceive. If it's an auditory cue, you want to make sure that it's something the animal's not going to hear at any other time other than the training time. So if it's a scent, you want to make sure it's a smell that they're not going to just be smelling all the time. You want it to be very unique so that it recognizes that cue distinctly from all of the other noise, all of the other stimuli in its environment, because you want that cue to really stand out and really be salient to the animal so that they recognize it immediately and know that they're to do this behavior and they'll get reinforced.
Makes sense also to think about the environment and all the other stimuli, that are around to make your target or the focus stand out somehow.
And I generally will start out in a quiet environment that's not busy. And then as the animal learns, I will add more and more chaos to the environment, because you ideally want the animal to be able to generalize that behavior outside of its home environment. Like I've had snakes that have done their targeting behavior at the veterinarian's office. And I don't expect them to be able to do that right off, because it's a strange environment. It's a veterinarian's office. There's strange people there. They haven't seen the environment before. But if we've slowly introduced distractions here and more to their environment here and still got them to focus on their target, then they will successfully also do that at the vet or other locations.
And thinking about species or situations, would you say, are there also limitations? You also talked or reported about venomous snakes already. Is that generally possible to say it's really not applicable, for example, the training or these practices for maybe certain species, certain situations, or is it not possible to generalize that? Wouldn't you say that like there's a chance for any
So the principles of learning theory apply across species, at least across vertebrates. Vertebrates, things with a brain, a spinal column, neurochemicals, similar or homologous hormones. So all vertebrates are similar or have similar brain structures, neurochemicals, etc. And so learning principles are going to work the same across vertebrates. The concepts of behavior science apply the same. But what you have to adapt is you have to adapt your training techniques so that that individual learner and that specific species is going to be able to perceive your cues, is going to be appropriately reinforced, and is going to be placed in a training environment that makes sense to them. So when I first started training the snakes to get on a scale, and I was working with these semi-arboreal pythons that are used to climbing and anchoring onto something when they eat, I was trying to shift them out onto like a flat baby scale, like just a flat metal scale. And it didn't really mean anything to them. Like that was not an attractive environment to them, and it didn't mean anything to them within their species' natural behaviors. But when I put a branch on the scale, I set a little perch on the scale, like imagine a bird perch, a wooden bird perch. I set one on the scale, and the snake immediately followed the target onto that perch and anchored around it, and now was on the scale because that made sense to the animal. It didn't make sense to a semi-arboreal snake to slither onto a flat metal surface. But when I put something there that mimicked a tree branch, it immediately shifted and anchored onto that perch and shifted onto the scale. And so what we need to keep in mind is that we are logically setting up our training environments based on the species' natural history and natural behavior. So if you're working with water snakes, if you're working with fossorial snakes, if you're working with arboreal snakes, you need to make sure that you're keeping that in mind and ask yourself, does this training setup make sense to that snake? Or is it not going to be an attractive location for that snake to move to or to shift to? It's not going to be attractive for my python to shift into water, but my false water cobra would shift immediately into a vat of water because she loves water. So if I ask her to shift into a big pool of water, she's going to immediately do that. It makes sense to her. So the laws of learning stay the same, but how we apply them has to be adapted for the individual learner.
It reminds me of, for example, a veterinary zoo setting. I experienced once weighting a koala, where they also had a branch on the scale because, of course, the koala doesn't want to sit on the floor, and immediately, of course, it felt more safe, as I imagined could hold on to the branch and was very calm instead of carrying it around. I mean, carrying was even better then, but instead of leaving it on the floor, as you
Right.
described, a flat scale, that's
Exactly.
kind of unnatural for the animal in general to lay or sit on. Why should it? It would rather climb
Right.
up and hold on.
And we also need to know how the learner perceives their world. From their point of view,
Mm,
what are the strongest modalities that they use to perceive their world? We want to put thought into our cues. Like if it's a snake with really poor vision or a blind snake, there are species of blind snakes. Or if it's just an animal that's been blinded, like we've had a blind horse here at our sanctuary.
mm,
So obviously, we're not going to use a visual cue to train that animal. We're going to use an audible cue or some kind of smell or a tactile cue, like some kind of touch. All of those things are still a cue to the animal. It's just you need to know, how does your animal perceive the world? Does it perceive it most strongly visually, auditorily, tactile, taste, smell, or a combination? Snakes are generally really good at sensing vibration, at smelling, and many of them, like the pythons, really do respond well visually to
mhm,
specific colors and lots to movement. But I've had a client who had a blind rainbow boa and trained that snake with a scent, with a specific smell as the target. So they would scent like a Q-tip with a specific smell and
mhm,
paired that smell with a reinforcer. And so then the snake would learn to follow that scent out of hiding or out
mhm.
of the enclosure, and then it would get reinforced. So you just have to work with your individual learner to apply the principles of behavior science. The principles don't change, but how you apply them is going to have to change based on your learner.
Yeah, diving into these examples and your experiences and the individuals, has there been maybe a situation that impressed you the most or that really stood out? Like you maybe yourself weren't expecting that this might work or that this super scary animal could ever change? Was there maybe a situation you will never forget?
I mean, I would
Special.
say just the snakes in general have surprised me when I started training them several years ago. It doesn't surprise me anymore, but in the beginning, I was constantly surprised at how much they could learn and
Mhm.
how much they could do. But I will say things like the behavior I described tonight, where the snake is traveling from several rooms
Hmm.
away in our facility and finding his target and then stationing himself on it and waiting there. Like when I came in here, he had probably been there. I don't know how long he'd been there. So then I, as a trainer, have to make a choice. Well, because I didn't cue that, do I take the target away and ignore it, or do I reinforce his effort? And in this case, I reinforced his effort
Mhm.
because he was literally doing what he had been trained to do. And I feel like if I want him to go to that target when I need him to, that I need to reinforce the effort he made tonight. So I thawed something out and I fed him because I have
Uh,
used the target to get that particular snake out of places I didn't want him in. Like he got in the back of one of our appliances one time and I couldn't get to him, and I showed him the target and he came out on his own and down to the floor, and I was able to pick him up and put him away. So I reinforced that. So I feel like if I want the target to work when I need it to work, that I need to reinforce his effort.
mhm.
If I'm careless and I leave it out and he finds it, I should reinforce that. So I did reinforce that. But those things surprised me because I didn't ask him to do that. I didn't cue that. And he wasn't even in this room, and
Mhm.
he saw that target and he did a behavior that he had been trained to do. And I find that amazing.
Yeah, and thank you for adding this end to this story because in this situation I was wondering how it ended. Like, would you reinforce that now, or how
Yeah.
did you like clear up the situation? Now?
I mean, you can make a choice. And I've told clients, I'm not going to tell you what to do. That's your choice. If that
Hmm.
happens, and I've had clients who've said that has happened to them, like they've left the target out and the snake has been free roaming for exercise and it's found the target. And you can look at that one of two ways. You didn't cue it, so you could just ignore it. But I feel like I want to reinforce the target in particular as if I need the snake to respond to that target, I want them 100% of the time to respond to it. So I usually choose to reinforce it. And the next time I'm just more careful about putting it away. But if it's another circumstance like shift training, I have some portable stations on wheels, and I'll roll them up to the enclosure and open the door, and the snake can choose to come out or not. And if they choose to come out, sometimes I reinforce with food. Sometimes I don't reinforce, because just the act of coming out and exploring is freedom's reinforcing for them too. So in that case, I'm not cueing the behavior. They're choosing to come out on the activity station. Sometimes I'll give them food, sometimes I won't. So if they go to an activity station on their own, I don't generally reinforce that, because it's a behavior that's self-reinforcing to them. Like, they find it reinforcing, or they wouldn't go there. But if it's something like a target that's always going to be a directed behavior that I want them to follow, I tend to reinforce that 100% of the time. As the keeper or the trainer, you've got to make those choices on what's going to work for your situation. The target is something I want to be 100% salient cue. I've used it for emergency recalls. I've used it at the veterinarian. I want it to always work, so I'm always going to reinforce it. But if it's a station or an activity area, that's more like playing a slot machine, where sometimes you get paid out, sometimes you don't, but you keep going back to it. That's kind of what the activity stations are like. You know, the snakes can choose to interact with them, and sometimes they're going to get extra reinforcement, and sometimes they won't. But I find that they're still going to, but that is a self-directed behavior. That's something they're doing on their own, not something I need them to do right now.
And what I also found very interesting about you're thinking about the training situation, that of course it's a teamwork, and you have to think of the trainer too. As you said, maybe also learning experience for you or the trainer in that situation. Oh, maybe next time I tidy up more carefully, and that each training also, as you explained earlier, has to be tailored or customized maybe to the situation and the people involved, maybe also what they are capable of doing.
That's a really good point, because with some species, you have to be patient because they move slowly. Some species move quickly, and you have to stay ahead of them. So, for example, I find boas learn to do behaviors well, but they move very slowly. So I've had boas shift out of their primary habitat onto a station following a target, but it takes them like 8 minutes. And so it's not that they're not doing it, it's just that's how slowly in their mind they do the behavior. But my python will do that same behavior in 30 seconds or a minute. And then the false water cobra, it's going to do it in like 3 seconds. And I have to be ready to reinforce that, because it is going to move out of the primary habitat so fast into the shift that I need to be ready to reinforce and close the shift, or the snake is going to be loose and it's going to have already eaten the reinforcer, and I don't have it contained yet. So you've got to adapt your training time to the individual as well, not just the environment, but you kind of need to know how fast does this learner perform the behavior. And, you've got to make sure that you're in the right mindset to be patient enough for the boa or fast enough for the false water cobra. I find pythons and I are just right for each other. I like working with them because sometimes my patience for the slower snakes isn't there, and the false water cobra is just so fast. I would like her to be a little bit more methodical, but she's just not.
And patience, I imagine, can also be so challenging, maybe being patient, or if I even think now of the lizards, I mean, also depending on species, but I guess they're also more on the quicker side.
They are.
So you really need to be prepared and adapt to that.
You do. They're going to be quicker to move and quicker to consume their food than a snake. Because if I'm going to do 2 or 3 repetitions with my python, I reinforce, I have a few minutes for it to eat and reposition till it's ready to do another repetition. But if I'm working with the leopard gecko, it's eating its, mealworm immediately, and it's ready for the next repetition. So and it's going to move a lot faster because it has legs and it can run. So there are some larger monitor lizards, and lizards can move fast, and you've got to be prepared for that.
Yeah, and thinking of the spectrum of, let's say, animals or issues or situations where the training could be applied. Do you think that any area is underrepresented still in terms of research, or are you curious, maybe even having a current or future project, finding out something specific or training something specific? Is there anything you think,
I think
yeah,
that there
still needs
needs to
more
be
research or
more
training?
research
Yeah.
into reptile cognition in general, because I think reptiles are very underrated in their cognitive abilities. I mean, I've seen them do some amazing things. So I would like to see
Mm-hmm.
more research
Mm-hmm.
specifically into reptile learning and cognition. And then also early development. I was recently involved in a research project. We're working on the manuscript right now to submit for publication, but on maternal care in Somalia amethystina, which is a scrub python. And the mother maternally incubated the clutch of eggs, and then the babies and mom were left alone after the babies hatched, so they weren't interfered with. And the babies stayed with mom for 3 or 4 days, and mom actually exhibited maternal care behaviors towards those babies before they left the nest.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that is an area of study in reptiles that's also underrated, because I think more species exhibit maternal care, social learning, and
Mm-hmm.
some benefit from early development with their conspecifics, whether that's parents or siblings, for even a short period, whether that's a few days or a few weeks. I think that can make a difference later in
Mm-hmm.
life. And I think that's extremely understudied.
Is it more difficult to train animals that are housed in a group, or does it not really apply for reptiles in general? Is that not
Yeah,
so
so
common that we house them in groups? I just had turtles. That's
uh-huh.
a long time ago. I had two.
When training animals that are housed in groups, I usually recommend training them individually first,
Ah.
and then training them at the same time together. So like I had two inland carpet pythons that were cohab
Mm-hmm.
for almost their whole lives, but I trained them individually first. Like when I would do their training sessions, they were each trained to their own target, and I would train one and then I would train the other. And then at some point, I put them back together and train them at the same time. And they're the ones that did learn to discriminate between their own target and the other target. And I could target them at the same time, and they would each go to their own target. And even with dogs, like we've had up to 17 dogs here at our sanctuary at one time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll usually train one dog, like say to sit stay. And then I'll put two together and then three. But they've all individually learned the behavior
Mm-hmm.
first. And then I start bringing them all together to do it as in a group. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that that works best when you're training animals that are going to work in a group or live in a group, is if you can train the individual behavior with one animal first and then start working with them together. I think that works best. Or you can have two trainers. So let's say you have two animals cohab that you can't separate, then you
Mm-hmm.
need two trainers, one that is
Mm-hmm.
working in this section of the habitat with this animal and one that's working over here with this animal. And you keep each animal's attention and train them to their specific cue. And then I think eventually, when they've learned their specific cues, one trainer can train both of them at the same time.
Because I also thought there might be like more social hierarchies, for example, also in terms of behavior. And so maybe also in reptiles if they are in a group.
So
Mm.
that is really relevant in some species, like
Yeah.
African wild dogs. You really don't want to
Mm.
separate them for training. So you want more than one keeper, so that you're working with one and somebody else is keeping the
Ah.
other one, keeping the other one's attention. There is documented incidences of social learning in reptiles. There's been a couple of
Mm.
studies with lizards that have documented social learning. So the lizard has watched another lizard perform a behavior, and then they've been able to do it.
Mm.
And I've seen it in horses. I've seen it in dogs. There's a whole program with dogs called Do As I Do, where the dogs copy a behavior that they see their trainer do, and they're able to learn that way. I think that that's something understudied in snakes. I don't know of any published paper about specifically social learning in snakes, but anecdotally, I've seen it here. I have seen snakes watch other snakes do a behavior, and then when I've gone to work on that behavior with them for the first time, they've just done it the first time.
And that's super interesting also to view this from different perspectives, because when I thought about this social structure, let's say in the animal group, I thought maybe having the two trainers is advantageous because, let's say, the animal that's lower in the hierarchy might otherwise not have the chance to do the training because the more,
Right.
let's say, higher ranked
Mhm.
animal would start. But also super interesting that you mentioned you might even destroy or complicate group structures. Of course, if you take animals out,
Right.
that would naturally stay together, and then
Right.
maybe the moment you return them, you changed or shifted the whole group
Correct.
structure. And
There are some species where that is highly relevant, and others where
Mhm.
it doesn't seem to make a difference. I mean, back to the social learning, our sanctuary last year took in a snake that was gravid when it got here and laid a clutch of eggs. And those babies stayed with mom for a few weeks. They watched mom eating and drinking and target training. And those babies on their own started to copy her behavior. And when I fed them the first time, I showed them the target. They responded to the target. They ate the first time, and they had watched mom do all that. So it was very easy to get them established on food because they just seemed to be copying what they had seen their mom doing. And I think that when people think about snakes, they don't think about that. They don't think that snakes can learn that way, but I don't know how else they would have known to do that if it hadn't been from watching their mom do it.
Yeah, and that again emphasizes that you need to be aware of their biology, right? Of their natural behaviors. For example, if there is maternal care naturally, if they would stay in a social group or bond, maybe lifelong or for a certain period of time. Super important to know, of course,
Right.
before working with the animals.
Well, and even if there's not specific maternal care,
Mhm.
if one animal's watching another animal
Yeah.
do something, they're still going to be presumably learning from that. I think that these babies obviously did because they just started to hunt like mom was hunting, and then they started responding to the training target and eating, and I didn't do anything special except for just offer them that opportunity. I mean, they weren't born or hatched knowing what a training target was. They had seen mom respond to it and eat in response to it, and then they started doing it. That was just very enlightening for me. And I'm not a breeder. We don't deliberately breed animals here, but we occasionally will get in an animal that's pregnant or that has a baby with them. And so we do get some rare opportunities to learn a little bit about their development and how training the mom or the siblings impacts the learning of the other individuals.
So I think all these, let's say, informed management and helpful training, I think could all contribute to a modern husbandry of exotics and reptiles, because I had another, let's say, point or question on my list. If you could comment maybe generally on modern husbandry or a wish list you could have, could you comment on how it should look like, if it's even possible to have general comments considering all these different species and individual animals, but yeah, maybe thoughts on modern ethical husbandry of
Yeah,
our
I mean,
exotics in our care.
so given that these animals, that exotic animals are in captivity, and starting with that premise, and like we could have a whole nother podcast on whether it's even ethical to keep wild animals in captivity, but let's just start with the premise
Start there.
that as a human race, we keep wild animals and they are here. I think ethically the best that we can do for them to make sure they're experiencing not just adequate welfare, but enhanced well-being, is to think about their species' natural history and natural behaviors and give them a habitat and a lifestyle that is going to best match those natural behaviors. For some species, it's going to be more important that some of those natural behaviors are done with natural substrates and natural foliage and natural living environments. and less so for others. And like, for example, the carpet pythons, the Brettles pythons, they just adapt so well to living in and near human structures that it's more important to them that they can perform climbing and anchoring and fully stretching out than it is whether they're doing that on PVC or a real branch. Whereas other species seem to gravitate more towards naturalistic substrates and real trees and real branches. And so it's going to be really important to know not only about that species, but your individuals that you're keeping. Like, do preference testing, I guess is what I'm saying. And we've done some of that here, where we will divide a habitat into two spaces that are identical except for one difference, like substrate versus no substrate, or overhead heat versus belly heat. And we see what the snake chooses to use over the other. And that's what preference testing is. And it's done with all sorts of species. I read a paper a couple of years ago that was really interesting, where cats at a shelter were given what they called choice chambers. So the cats were placed in a center cubicle, and they had tunnels going to these different chambers that had various resources, and they marked what the cats seemed to prefer as far as resources. So preference testing when we're keeping animals in captivity is really important, because we need to let the animals tell us what they prefer. We can't presume to know what the animal is going to prefer. We can start based on their species, natural history, natural biology, natural behavioral repertoire as our baseline, but then we need to let the individuals tell us what they prefer. And the only way we can do that is by giving them choices and the agency to act on those choices. And if we don't do that, we can't really make assumptions. So if you tell me that your snake never climbs, but you keep it in a tub with no climbing opportunities, then of course it's not climbing. It can't climb because you haven't given it the opportunity to climb. But if you offer it the opportunity to climb and the opportunity to have terrestrial activities, and you've had it years and years and it's never once climbed, then you can probably say, okay, this species doesn't climb, or this individual doesn't climb. I've had it 5 years and it's never climbed. But you can't do that unless it has those opportunities. We also can't just assume that because an animal's not using a resource physically, that it isn't psychologically using that resource. And there's been more than one paper that shows animals will behave differently when the presence of a resource is there or not, even if they're not physically interacting with it, specifically with hides. So there's been a couple of papers where when there's been a hide present, an animal will engage in a resource longer, even when a predator is nearby, than if that hide is not present. If the hide's not present, then the animal's not, then as soon as a predator is nearby, the animal's going to run. And so I do hear people all the time say, well, this hide's been in my snake's enclosure for a month and it's never used it. Well, that doesn't mean that it's not psychologically using it. Knowing the hide is there may lower anxiety, may lower stress levels, may make the animal feel safer knowing that it's there if it wants to use it, even if it's not using it. And if you take it away, it could increase stress levels and increase anxiety because now it doesn't have that available. And so we need to be careful with assumptions we make about what animals are using and not using.
And now I'm thinking, so I'm very thankful for sharing your expert insight. And if our listeners now think, wow, I want to learn more and I also want to apply these practices and learn it, what would be your advice? Of course, you're offering a training. I think you're active online. Maybe tell us more what we can do if we want to dive deeper into the topic and want to learn more and apply these practices.
Yeah. So I have acquired a long list of references about a lot of these topics. So if you want to ask me about something specific, like a paper to read on one of these specific topics, like a few come to mind that I refer to all the time because I feel like they're very significant papers along these lines. You can contact me. Or just go to Google Scholar and start putting in some of these keywords I mentioned and look up these papers for yourself. But you can contact me. I have a website, behavior education.org. I have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/behavior education. And that is where my clients sign up for private video coaching or written consultations. And then I have a level where I do 2 group meetings a month too. That's on Patreon. I am on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. YouTube, of course. I try to put a lot of free content on YouTube to get people started. I have some mini courses, mini as in small, short courses on there. And I just want people to have access to some of this information without having to pay. I realize everybody can't pay for private consultations. So I try to put a lot of content on YouTube to make sure that it's accessible. But if people want more private consultations like email, written consultations, video chats, that's where I have paid Patreon tiers that as an organization or as an individual, you can go to Patreon and there are different levels on there that get you different services.
This is great. Thank you.
I have an email too, Behavior Education LLC @gmail.com. And then if you're interested specifically in what our animal sanctuary does, and we have multiple species here, and so I'm a fear-free certified practitioner trainer, and then everyone that works at our animal sanctuary has to go through the fear-free shelters program. So if you want to learn more about that kind of stuff, our animal sanctuary is spiritkeeperanimalsanctuary.org. And right now we do have several snakes that were seized in a law enforcement case last year that are actually here for rehabilitation and eventual adoption. So there's a link to find out more about that case as well.
Great. We can equip our show notes as well with links and with a significant material. Super. Yeah, with super summaries. Again, thank you for sharing all these exciting insights. It made me also think more and let additional questions arise. Is there something we didn't cover? Do you want to add something or some advice, words you want to share with our listeners? You are free and very welcome to do so.
Yes. So one of the biggest things that I'm focusing on right now, and actually, hopefully this will get proved for my doctoral dissertation, is applying person-environment fit theory to human-animal compatibility. And what I mean by that and why this is so important is I see way too often people get animals, whether it's a snake or another species, and they find out after they have it, it's not meeting their expectations. It's not compatible with their lifestyle and what they thought their life with that animal was going to look like. And that's because now you have this poor mismatch between what the human expected and what the animal actually is capable of being. So, for example, I have had clients that say, I got this snake and it hides all the time and I never see it. And what can I do to fix that? And I ask them what species of snake it is. And it's a species of snake that's nocturnal, that does hide all the time. And they want that snake to change to meet their expectations of being awake during the day and being active. And it's not going to happen because they chose a species that wasn't compatible with their expectations and lifestyle. And so I do offer services before people get a snake or other animal to try to go through their expectations and then research species that would be a good match for them. Because if that match ends up being good, then that person is more likely to keep that animal for its lifetime. The person's going to experience better well-being. The animal's going to experience better welfare. That is important to me because I see way too many animals rehomed, abandoned, neglected because they're not meeting the human's expectations. So hopefully moving forward in my doctoral research, I can delve into this topic because I think that it's something that is important. People shouldn't just be getting animals on a whim because their friend has it or they like the way it looks without knowing that that animal's temperament and personality and lifestyle is going to match their own.
That's super meaningful and super useful initiative, and could prevent mismatches and disappointment on both sides, and also for the animal that might be forced to come out during the day while it's not supposed to do so based on its natural behavior. Yeah, like for example, choosing a dog because you like its outer appearance, right? Might not be the right approach to
No, because
purchase a dog.
one of the breeds I work with is I work with Norwegian Elkhounds, and I love them, and they work very well out here on a ranch away from people, and they're super cute puppies. They're fluffy. They're super friendly with people, but they bark a lot. They are going to bark. It is part of their innate nature to bark. Like they were developed to bark at moose when they found it and alert hunters from miles away. Here's the moose, come to where I am. So they are going to bark at everything, and people in cities get them, and then the dog is barking all the time, and they get barking dog complaints, and they can't stand the barking. And I see so many Norwegian Elkhounds for adoption and rehoming around the age of 1 or 2 years old, because now they've grown up and this barking behavior is being exhibited, and it's just natural, and people didn't expect that, and now they don't want the dog anymore. And so that's just a perfect example of, I don't care if it's a dog or a rabbit or a snake, make sure that the breed or the species and its natural behaviors are going to be compatible with where you live and what you can provide for it and your expectations. Because it's not fair to that animal to decide you don't like it and you don't want it anymore, or it's too much of a pain and you want to get rid of it. Like, that's not fair.
So please, people, listeners, inform yourselves, and we are contributing to the whole story, like by sharing knowledge and talking to experts. So I fully agree that this is super useful and the best approach to just be informed and do it up front and to know what to expect, and also to be happy, because then also for us, it's a more fulfilling experience if it works and if we chose the right friend and don't have to take care of rehoming it or living a life that's not ideal for both sides.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think it's a super interesting and significant addition to the knowledge you already have and the work you do to focus on the human-animal relationship and to even put more emphasis and more insight and details from this perspective to shaping the whole human-animal experience.
Right.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you. Thank you so much. Me, myself, I learned a lot too.
Good.
And if we don't want to add anything at this point, I can also thank you again and say goodbye for now to our listeners.
I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you, and I'm happy to talk anytime. I could talk about these subjects forever. So thank you for giving me the opportunity, and I'm happy to delve more deeply into any of these topics if you want to in the future.
Thank you for your time, your openness. As I said, we will equip our show notes to have all further information in place to contact you, to read more, learn more, watch YouTube videos, everything that's there. And thank you all for listening. Of course, if you want to contact our podcast team as well, you can do so anytime. You're very welcome, either via email, podcast.daretocare@gmail.com, or for example via Instagram. This is daretocare_podcast. And I hope you enjoyed this interview and this time as much as I did, and look forward to our next episode. And thank you very much again, Lori. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.